Hello, this is Zach D. Roberts, and this week on the Visu.News podcast, Aaron Cynic and myself speak with journalist Kit O'Connell about the media's use of language around police violence and shootings. The favored phrases of the unbiased news media around these incidents are often of a passive tone, not wanting to lay blame on anyone in law enforcement. But the same doesn't go for the victims of police violence, of course, as they are often described as suspects right out of the gate. Kit wrote an excellent and concise piece on the media's use of the term officer-involved shooting that asks the question, how exactly was the officer involved? Let's get into it. Kit, could you give a short intro about yourself and what you do and who you are?
Sure. Hi, I'm Kit O'Connell. I use he, him, or they, them pronouns. I am a freelance gonzo journalist at the moment. No particular permanent place to hang my hat. Mm-hmm. I've been writing for quite a few years now about human rights issues, inequality, anything that I can kind of sink my teeth into where it seems like it can make a difference. Mm-hmm. And something I've come back to a lot, of course, is the police state. You know, yes. That's something that really draws me back over and over again.
Yeah, kind of unfortunately an omnipresent thing with when you cover this world at all. It never comes back. It never stops becoming a news story as we put into the context the Toledo, the video of 13-year-old kid being murdered by police officers in Chicago. Toledo just dropped. Both Aaron and I just watched it, so if we're a little off, but you wrote a piece for your site, which I'm quickly going through my 17,000 tabs that I have open, desperately trying to find it.
Yeah, I'm at kitoconnell.com.
There you go.
And I wrote this piece about officer-involved shootings, or at least the language of officer-involved shootings, with some quote marks, air quotes around that phrase.
Yeah, no, it's Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no. So it's a phrase. It's a phrase that officer-involved shooting. It's a phrase that unfortunately, I think, partially because of the length of like Twitter and that sort of thing becoming the kind of one of the main news or ways we can get it, and also the keeping the supposedly at least AP kind of like safe generalities. Well, we don't want to lay blame on anyone, on what could thing. And so we just use this kind of catch-all term, even though 9 times out of 10, in fact, I can't actually think that I've ever heard an officer-involved shooting where it's the other way around. Usually it's an officer was shot. They actually define it. So what, I guess what motivated you to actually put out a piece?
Well, I've been thinking about it a little bit. Of course, this is language. It's interesting that you mentioned the AP, because of course they've in their AP style book, they've said you shouldn't use this language anymore. You shouldn't say officer involved shootings. I'll read this tweet from them from August 25 from AP style book. Avoid the vague officer involved shootings and other cases involving police. Be specific about what happened. If police use the term, ask, how was the officer or officers involved? Who did the shooting? The information is not available or not provided, spell that out. Now, you make a good point. On Twitter, it's really hard to encapsulate those nuances. But I think it's still this phrase that, even though it's been discouraged both by the media itself in some ways like this, and by the populace, it still keeps coming back. It's just this easy phrase that journalists and their editors, of course, reach for over and over again. But what really inspired me is there were 2 tweets from ABC, the official ABC News account. They were within about 12 hours of each other. And one of them was developing Maryland State Police are investigating a trooper-involved fatal shooting in Leonardtown that ended in the death of a 16-year-old. So what happened there? I'm assuming the trooper shot the 16-year-old, but and if you actually go look at the article, it's been updated at this point. It now has a pretty good headline: Maryland State Trooper fatally shoots 16-year-old. So that's what happened. Mm-hmm. That's a Twitter link encapsulation of what happened. State Trooper shot a 16-year-old. Yeah. But we end up with this officer-involved shooting. There was this other tweet that makes the point you were making, Zach. It was, again, from ABC. This one says, a suspect is at large after shooting a Texas police officer multiple times during a traffic stop overnight. So there we have, if the cop shoots somebody and kills them, what happens is, we don't know. We get this officer involved shooting, this vague language. But if somebody shoots a cop, we know exactly what happened. Suspect shot the Texas police officer. They're on at large, so they went on the run. We can figure out what happened in that Twitter link encapsulation of what.
Yeah.
But
that doesn't.
I thought
yeah.
it was.
Good.
I just thought it was really interesting, like, you know, and it's just such a blatant example of how, like, the media, the same media, you know, and presumably even some of the same staff, you know, at the social media team at ABC can tweet about these events and use drastically different language based on who's involved.
Yeah. I you know, it's one thing I wonder whether it's all part. I mean, obviously we'll talk about the, you know, the political leaning and, like, you know, putting police's word first and that sort of thing. But, like, so much I find is, you won't believe which movie did this, or you won't believe what, you know, find out, click here to find out, because you have to, especially when they know, like, sometimes you have, like, breaking news and 9/11, you know, was it breaking news 9/11 or whatever that Twitter handle is that does, that really don't trust it. But you know, basically puts out stories the moment that there's anything on Chatter, there's anything like, you know, officer involved is a, well, like, well, there was a police officer involved. It wasn't between two civilians or whatever. And but if you're an actual news story, and like as you did with the ABC tweets and news stories, is they knew what the situation was. They knew what was going on, and just decided within the Twitter encapsulation, you know, Twitter posts to actually do that. And a lot of times they will have other tweets out, especially later, that are more specific. And so it's maybe it's the most, like, I don't even know if that's more cynical or less or whatever, that, like, the idea is that, well, we'll get more people to click through to the news story and not just share on Twitter and give the interactions there. Like, because I don't understand why you wouldn't want to, especially if you're especially if you're a larger news agency, wouldn't want to just give out the info where so much of the way that you get news out is through social media, as opposed to people going directly to, you know, for me, you know, poststandard.com or Syracuse.com. Yeah.
It's hard for me to, I mean, you know, it's hard for me to separate it from the political context of how police are treated in our culture, because, you know, even from a clickbait perspective, I think, you know, trooper shoots 16-year-old, that's going to get people to click these days. I'm going to click on that, you know, but this officer involved shooting thing, one of the things that inspired the story is I've noticed people on Twitter have started tweeting at these official accounts, how was the officer involved? And if you go look at the replies, you just see one after another, how was the officer involved? I've done it myself now, just because it's just like a way to let off steam at this bad practice, you know, and just let them know that it's like, no, we see what you're doing. This isn't what really is happening. You're repeating a cop message and not doing your journalistic job of telling us what happened to who, when, where, why, all those basics.
Yeah. I think that's a good, I mean, it's also interesting too. I wonder how much of the social media teams at a lot of these sites, how much of them are trained journalists versus even a trained social media person who works for a media company is dramatically different than someone who actually knows has a deeper understanding of, like, well, this is what these words will mean to my audience, versus this is what those words mean to get people to clicks and get the right, you know, SEO and everything like that. And because, I mean, like, so many times you will read, I mean, it's like, did you read the article? Did the social media person actually read the article that they posted this link from? Because, like, I mean, I think, is it Slate or Salon? I think it's Slate is one of the worst, is because they'll actually use, like, incorrect, like, questions to get people to click on older op-eds or older like posts and things like that. And it's, you know, obviously just to kind of get it. I mean, again, I mean, I think at the end of the day, though, like, this is all just conversation when at the end of the day, it just works out to be, as you described before, propaganda. Can you, I know this is a thing, but like, what can you give a description of propaganda? Because I mean, it's a term I
Sure.
think we all throw out there, or at least we do, but
And I loved also when I wrote this article that when I was looking for a link to a definition of that.
yeah.
Of course, one of the first that came up was Teen Vogue. We've always got to give them a little bit of a shout out. The good people on some of that on that team are doing some good work. So propaganda is when instead of it's like access journalism. It's when instead of investigating something, the journalist just takes the word, essentially like repeating a press release from the cop, just repeats it, makes it the headline, makes it the story. And as you mentioned, kind of hinted at before, they tend to weight police word over community word. So if a police officer says, the suspect was armed, and a member of the community says the person was unarmed, the reporter is meant to believe the quote unquote neutral voice to the reporter is the police officer, and the biased voice is the community member. And of course, we know they both have their biases, and that's that's not really what a reporter should do. Now, I did get this interesting. I want to make sure I mentioned. I got today, just kind of shortly before we started recording, I got this kind of interesting reply from Katie Hall, who's a reporter at the Austin American-Statesman, and she agreed with me. She actually does criminal justice and covers police issues there. So this is her beat, and she agreed with me. She said that language, is basically unacceptable. But she did bring up there have been some nuanced cases where it is complicated for a reporter. We had this shooting here in Austin, the Mike Ramos case last year, where really terrible situation. It started when a neighbor reported that someone was doing drugs in their car. Just a great example to me of those things. Like, you don't need to call the cops for that. I don't know why. That's not something we should involve people with guns over. Well, people with guns got involved. Mike Ramos was killed. Now, what ended up happening is he was shot as he was driving away. And the police initially reported that he was basically fleeing quickly in his car, even sort of implied that he was driving at them. Now, initially it wasn't clear whether he had died from the gunshot wounds or from like crashing his car from being shot at. Now, that's still like, I don't think police involved shooting is appropriate there. And I don't think that's even what Katie was saying, but she was just making the point that there are these situations where it is hard to tell what happened. But again, like I think with AP's guidelines there, they say, if you don't know, say you don't know. Don't just repeat what the police are saying.
Yeah.
I think that it says something, because like you even brought up the AP, it's like they're conservative to the point of hodginess. They catch up to the culture years after the rest of us do in the media.
Yeah.
But even they've updated their guidelines to say, look, this language is inaccurate, and you can't just take cops' words. You have to report.
Yeah.
And I think that says something.
It is interesting because like I find that there's such a argument. Like I'm friends with a lot of I guess mainstream like I can't say AP style in this context, like mainstream wire photographers, and we argue a lot about captioning, because again it kind of has that same world within photojournalism, is that you're trying to use as few amount of words as possible, trying to be one sentence. Basically, you're trying to put a tweet underneath the photo that gives the explanation around the photo. And so, I mean, like we've had this, it's like the protests escalated. And it's just like protest turned violent, which is my kind of my
Clash
phrase
with
that like
police
immediately causes me to twitch, because it's like I've never been to a protest where the protest itself, because that obviously would not imply the police officers, because they are police officers, and then there are protesters. Those are usually the two sides. The protest didn't turn violent. It is the police deciding that at some random moment they are in the wrong spot, whether they're supposed to be on the street or off the sidewalk, blocking the sidewalk to oncoming traffic, or it's a curfew now, and which is they get to throw those things out on a constant basis now. That like I guess it's the go-to thing. We just basically say everyone has to go home, and anyone, including journalists, are going to be arrested. But
I've been covering protests for years, and
yeah.
And protests turn violent. It's like when I hear that phrase, it's like everybody there collectively decided to attack the people in armor with tanks.
Yeah.
No, that never ever is going to happen, because no human being looks at cops armed the way they are and says, well, let's beat them up with our water bottles and umbrellas. That's not how it works.
No American.
People are out there to protect
the French
their
do it sometimes. But see, that's a joke.
I mean, fair, But
their protesters are a bit more,
that's not what these things happen. And exactly, reporters, I think, have this responsibility to talk about what really happened. And it's interesting that in those cases, sometimes reporters get a little more raw when they get arrested. Suddenly they're like, wow, cops were violent and out of control. It's like, you need to be telling that story even when they do temporarily respect your First Amendment rights. Even then, you should still be talking about what they're doing to the community. Well, I did want to add, because I was telling the Mike Ramos story before, it was unclear at the beginning, but here now in 2021, the police officer who shot him has actually been indicted for murder. So, what started unclear is very clear now. And I think, even if you didn't know at the beginning exactly what happened, exactly how, Mike Ramos died, it would have been doing a disservice to him and his family to say officer involved shooting, because right from the beginning, that situation was so muddy and weird and messy. It was clear to anyone thinking that there was something happening there more than just the police's story.
Yeah, I mean, that so much goes to the there's a great FAIR article written by Adam Johnson called Copspeak, 7 ways journalists use police jargon to obscure the truth. And number one is officer involved shooting. But the other one that I kind of they also hit on is, in a couple different ways. They talk about, the discharge, there was a discharged weapon, or there was the gun shoots person. Or after Charlottesville, the big one, it was just like that. And this is something that it's amazing, because it's like, I never went to journalism school, but I learned journalism from other journalists. And so just by reading and figuring out the best practices and whatever. And one of the things after Charlottesville was the car killed people. The car drove through not the person in the car. It was a Dodge that drove through the car and killed people. And it's like, well, no, the car didn't do that itself. It's just like the weapon didn't fire itself, and kill someone. And that language just, because it's so easy to use, and it's a thing but you're also then once again removing kind of any blame from the person that actually was shooting the weapon, which is more often
you're removing complete agency.
Exactly.
Whether the agency is bad or good, it's not even blame. It's just I mean, one of my favorites always was bullet strikes offender. Like, oh, the fuck is that? Where did the bullet come from? And what else is here? And it's just it's unfortunate that I think I'm sort of curious as to, and this goes to some of the stuff you guys were talking about earlier, just like how people are trained now, like how journalists and photographers and people who are telling stories are being trained, as far as telling stories like this, because for so long, it's been this sort of like propaganda and all of that has been ingrained in people. And for people who've been in the field for a long time, like that's how they wrote, and it's good that people are unlearning this and stopping it. But I'm left to wonder, like, younger generations and younger folks who are just coming up into the into the journalism world, are they still being taught to sort of be deferential to cops and other people in power? Because I feel like that's something that is still taking place. Like even watching footage of CNN last night, of what's happening in Minneapolis, just sort of the way people were describing things on the field. Live reporting is really difficult. Live streaming is really difficult, trying to contextualize what's happening and tell that story as you're watching it, as you're, choking down tear gas and all of that. But at the same time, in a lot of cases, a lot of the field reporting I saw tended to be very deferential to the police, where it's like, well, police are doing this, but these protesters are throwing bottles. And how do we move away from that? Because if we're supposed to be holding people accountable, people who we need to be holding accountable the most are the people with the fucking guns. And if we're not doing that, we're doing ourselves a disservice, and we're doing the community a disservice, whatever that community may be. So how do we go about I guess, changing the way that, what are some tips and tools, I guess, for people who are working, regardless if they've been doing this for 20 years or two? What are some things that, people can do in their reporting to sort of, get this structure out of their heads?
I think one great thing, one of the biggest things, is to find regular people and elevate their voices. And that's going to take time. It's more than a soundbite, and it takes building community respect. I saw actually a CNN encounter recently where someone came up very hostile to a CNN, and the reporter, I think, did her best to defuse it, but I totally understand why someone in the community would be hostile to those cameras, and so it takes time to build that trust. It's interesting. I was talking to someone from a major network, we'll say. It was on background, so I won't say who. And we were talking about, like, police, writing about protests. And I brought up how much I admire Chuck Modi, because I love what he does. He really elevates just the voices of regular people. A lot of his reporting is just going out, building trust, and then talking to people, giving them space and time to tell their stories, and making sure that they feel like they know him too, so that they don't feel like he's going to misrepresent them. And this reporter I talked to from the Wire service said, oh yeah, Chuck posts some good stuff, but I don't really consider him a reporter because he's too involved. And it's like, I don't know, it just frustrated me. And it's like, I think we need to stop, like, because people are passionate, because people see injustice and upsets them. You both started this conversation really upset about this video you just watched. Does that mean that you can't be reporters about this anymore? Of course not. Of course you can still be reporting on it. I think you should be reporting on it because it affected you. You're human beings. Like, we need to be human beings as reporters, and we need to elevate the voices of other people that don't have official positions, that aren't, elected officials or police unions or any of that. Just like regular people. That to me is one of the biggest things. And I think the reporters themselves, of course, need to be as diverse as possible too. That's something that needs to be improved in a lot of newsrooms too, of course.
I always think about how we don't expect the same thing from financial reporters. We don't expect financial reporters to not be invested in the stock market. And not care and be passionate and care. Obviously, if you show that in your reporting, then that's a problem. Like, if you go, well, I really think that you should do this, that's a problem, with it when it comes to financial, potentially, because that's, it's one of the reasons why, oh my God, I'm blanking on his name. That scummy British reporter, he used to be on CNN. Oh my God, I'm blanking on his name. Why he lost his job working as one of the editors over at the Sun, I think it was. But we don't. One of the biggest problems is that whether it be covering financial crime or whether it be covering police crime, is that often the people that are covering it are beat reporters who cover the crime beat or cover the financial beat, and every single time they write something, they have to worry. They think that they, and probably justifiably, have to worry that they're going to lose their sources that allow them to cover that sort of thing, which is why I don't think that people should be like the people that cover cops on a day, cover on a daily basis, maybe on a beat level, just like the police blotter sort of stuff. Whether or not the police blotter should exist in a newspaper is a different story. Or maybe it's the same story. But like the idea that if I have to worry, one of the reasons that when I come and go and cover something is that I can report kind of anything that's I don't have to worry about my sources, about sources coming in later on and not talking to me for the next story, because this story is not, an overwhelming, even the George Floyd, story and the police story isn't the only story that's going on and the only thing you're ever going to cover. And so a lot of reporters, I think, wrongfully worry about losing their sources. And I think that we need to have, God, I mean, especially for some of the larger papers, we need to have potentially a beat of its own that covers, actual, restorative justice or something like that, and covers it in a way so that they don't have to worry about, well, these cops are never going to talk to me again, and basically, I have to do my job as well. And I think that that's one of the reasons that you're actually seeing this weird, the only way that the quote unquote respect that journalists have for cops, of like, giving them the first and only, well, the police said this, and this bystander who witnessed the same thing obviously doesn't have the same weight as a police officer, which I, disagree. And is that, over time, maybe once they get out of that, the CNN reporter can kind of maybe say something. Anderson Cooper can, speak out about something every once in a while. But at the end of the day, they kind of revert back to, well, this is what the source is, and this is what we have to believe first. And I think we have to even potentially have like an entire kind of a beat of journalism that's completely out of that. But yeah, or we could just stop trusting cops, what they say in general, and not care. But I don't see that happening, unfortunately.
I mean, it's one of those things where it's also not just cops or spokespeople for cops or police unions. It's everyone in that system, and that also includes city officials. It includes, so many people. Like we were talking about earlier, here in Chicago, we were told, and it's also there's culpability to people who push that narrative as well, because as we were talking earlier, we just had a 13-year-old boy shot and killed by the cops here, and for already a week we here have been fed a narrative that, well, he had a gun, he pointed his gun at the cops, he had gun residue on his hand, and that then turned into opinion columns and all of these other things about how, well, he's no angel, and talking about like treating, well, we can't treat all children like children, and all of this really gross stuff. And it turns out, and literally right up until today, it turned out, about an hour or two before the video was released, the prosecutor apparently was, quote, and I quote, not fully informed. And once we see the video, the boy has his hands up. Now, whether or not he, threw, the video has to be combed over many times, and whether or not he had a gun and threw it or ran, he ran from police. But even with all these things, you have people that immediately say these things to justify what is an extrajudicial execution.
Yeah.
And that keeps happening everywhere. Well, he should have done this, he should have done that, he should have done that. But we never say, well, maybe that cop shouldn't have shot and killed him. That's what it comes down to. And there's a whole the machinations of how this happens. It is like clockwork. There are so many gears that move, and it happens all the time. And I'm sure, there are going to be protests, and I'm sure they're probably going to be large, and they're probably going to get bad. And that is going to happen because cops are going to come in and they're going to start beating on people. Chicago doesn't really, we don't blanket the city with tear gas. They like to use their clubs, as both of you know from being
an old
here
tradition.
many times. But
Yep.
what will happen is they will escalate, and people will escalate back because that's what happens.
Yep.
Yet all of the onus is still always on the victims to de-escalate and to, well, why, you could have done something differently so you didn't get murdered or beat up or whatever.
And for some reason, I've never seen in like a straight news story, I've never once said, by the way, the crime for holding a gun in the United States is not murder. It is not the death penalty. Like the idea that, you know, certain class of people get to just hold guns and walk around cities and not be shot, and then a different class of people don't get to do that and they get to get shot, which is for somebody tweeted out the long list of supposed crimes that, trying to pass which again, don't even have proof that it ever actually was, but like trying to pass a $20 bill, a counterfeit $20 bill, that is not a crime. That is not a death penalty crime. Trying to, having plates that weren't being shown correctly or something, not a death penalty crime. And for some reason, all of these things turn that way. And we never had that conversation where it's just like, why was a gun even drawn? Why was the potential for a firearm in this instant even being drawn? Especially with the new twist in Minneapolis of, well, I thought I was drawing my taser, not my firearm, which again shows, never mind, anyone who's ever held a gun and held a taser that has a pistol grip knows that basically you have to be the most incompetent person ever. I mean, that at minimum she should have never been serving as a police officer, not only as a union chief but also as a higher up and everything. I mean, it's stunning. Like, even if this was like an officer involved shooting that involved a first day police officer rookie, it would still be completely a completely batshit crazy excuse to try to pull off. And the fact that it works is kind of mind-blowing, because obviously they wouldn't do it otherwise. Like my last note on reading that, police are delicate creatures that have a strong union behind them that will libel and trash anyone that comes in their way, which is, I think, another reason why a lot of editors, I think it goes to the higher up, and will use the more comfortable words when it comes to police officers, as opposed to even firefighters, even other, first, quote unquote, first responders and that sort of thing, don't get the sort of protection that police officers do. And I think a lot of it, especially coming from, getting my first literal kicks and everything like that, covering police in New York City, it was always mind-blowing to watch. There'd be some scandal in the police department and it would be like, well, we have to wait to see what's happening, we have to know what's going on. Some scandal in the fire department, front page on New York Post, Daily News, everything like that, trashing them thing. And never mind, both of them are supposed to be first responders that are heroes and beyond reproach, but one side gets, but when you have a guy like Pat Lynch behind you in New York, then go ahead, sorry, Kit.
No, I just, to riff off of your example, we were talking about Mike Ramos. Like, I'll out myself here. I've done drugs in a car before, and I didn't get killed. Nobody called the cops on me. I wasn't murdered.
Yeah.
Maybe that was just luck. Maybe that's my white skin. But that's not even if the cops had been called on me, that's not a capital offense. Yeah. Doing drugs in a car, that's not something you should be killed for, regardless of your feelings on drug legalization.
Yeah.
And it is just amazing. I used an example in my article where the police is by the New York Times, and they changed here, I'll bring it up right now so I can read it. The original headline: officer near Minneapolis kills motorist and a crowd confronts the police. Okay, I know what happened. Here's they changed it to, there's that bot that they have called Editing the Gray Lady, which shows you the New York Times changes, and it changes to officer near Minneapolis shoots motorist, who dies, and a crowd confronts the police.
Yeah.
Now, by the end of things, we have Minnesota officer shoots driver and protesters clash with police, which is always something that clash is another one of those words. So it's like, even when they eventually admit that, the officer shot somebody and killed them, I'm amazed by that. Shoots motorist who dies. Yeah. Like, that's just such a horrible, contorted phrasing. If I turned that into an editor under any situation other than a police officer, they'd reject it.
Yeah.
Right? Like that
Yeah.
contorted language would be like, what are you saying here? Why is this headline a mess?
Yeah.
But if it's about a cop, that's what the
Yeah.
New York Times wants to. Don't say
Yeah.
kill. Oh God,
Yeah.
cops don't kill. Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah.
But they do. Cops kill. Let's
Yeah.
just admit it. Even if you're Mr. Number One cop supporter, just admit it. Cops kill. And some of them, I've seen some of them be like, oh yeah, that's what they're supposed to do. And I think those people are scumbags, but at least I guess they're being honest.
Yeah.
I don't know. But this idea that we can't even say cops kill, they're so precious and delicate that we can't even say that. It blows my mind a little bit, because they kill and they abuse and they hurt people all the time, and they're almost unaccountable for it. And there's this like ancient idea that the journalism, the fourth estate, is supposed to hold the other parts of our culture accountable. But it's like, when it comes to cops, nobody holds them accountable. We just give them more money.
Yeah. Well, that'll solve everything. You give them more money and then they'll stop. We're in a hostage situation when it comes to police officers in this country. I mean, that's at the end of the day, is we keep bribing them and keep trying to give them more money to do training, to do whatever else, to get better armor, to get better guns, to get whatever. I mean, one of the biggest things, I watch, I was in a cabin in Alaska for a month and a half, and I was binging Columbo for some reason. And Columbo famously hates having a gun. And I just even think about, like, if you look at their firearms, what there were like just 20 years ago or 40 years ago, and this idea that we've had this escalation on every hand, I mean, I don't know how else to end it. Kit, where can people find your work?
Yeah. So kitoconnell.com. It's OConnell, 2 N's, 2 L's, kitoconnell.com, or Kit O'Connell on Twitter. I'm on the Hell site way too much, so you can find me there. And patreon.com/Kit O'Connell. If you want to throw me a buck, that would be great.
Yep. Definitely do that. I am a subscriber to your
thank you. Yeah.
Patreon, and I highly recommend it. But thanks for joining us. And this is thanks from Aaron Cynic and myself. This has been the Visu.News podcast. This is Zach D. Roberts, and I thank you for listening. You can support this podcast at patreon.com/ZDRoberts and at patreon.com/Aaron Cynic. We're now on Podbean and should be available on all other places that you can find podcasts.